everything's sort of starting it off.
Yeah, well,
it's like formulation today.
Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself first and then introduce us and then?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that sound?
It looks like we're a bit dark there in the face.
I think it might just be the screen.
Yeah. Yeah.
How does it go a bit?
So you may admit all. Okay. Right. Welcome everybody to, I don't know what number webinar we're on now, but it's the second part of the formulation webinar. If you guys could just mute yourselves, please. Okay, should be all right. I'll just wait here for like the first 5 minutes so I can admit.
If you bring your chair a bit closer, because it might be that then you can help just make sure you're on the screen as well.
Okay, yeah. I'll just admit people if you want to.
Okay, so that's on the screen there, people don't see that.
Yeah, they don't see that. Okay. They don't see that.
Hello everyone. For people who don't know me. My name is Emily Barney. I'm a qualified clinical psychologist, and I own a mental health practice in Stourbridge called Brave Banana. But I've quite a few years' experience as a qualified clinical psychologist working in the NHS, and used to supervise Rachel and Saba. That's how we know each other. So we've got Rachel. What, you want to introduce yourself? Rachel in the corner, assistant psychologist and assistant psychologist in the NHS. Saba, I think I'm just about to see your
I'll be with you guys in like 15 minutes. I'm just letting everyone in, but yes, I'm here as well.
So the idea for these webinars came about just because I just remember how it felt even before I became an assistant psychologist. Sort of, I was a support worker, really knew I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, but just felt really disconnected from the world and felt like I just didn't know much about what it actually meant to be a psychologist, but also help to sort of get those roles. They're so competitive. So I just really wanted these webinars to be a bit more quite informal, and just to tell you a little bit more about what the role is like as a clinical psychologist, and also along the way to try to give some tips for any interviews that you're going to, or just things to think about. And I think we're trying to do it where we do sort of 45-50 minutes of me talking and Rachel and Saba sort of contributing as well on a topic. And today we're going to go over the second part to do with formulation. And I think we were going to leave sort of 10 minutes or so at the end for any questions, things like that. But there's just so much to talk about. So, but we are going to try to leave that time at the end for any questions to answer. Yeah? Is that all right? Yeah. So today, last month we did CBT formulation. Remember we started talking about the hot cross bun and the 5 Ps, which there is more to CBT formulation than that. But if you can remember hot cross bun and 5 Ps, that will help you. Today we're going to go through other forms of formulating. So I'm going to, it's probably a bit hard going for a Saturday morning. So you've got like a cup of coffee or something, but I really am going to give you a really brief overview and just to highlight what the different models are, because as a clinical psychologist, we really, when you're thinking about becoming one, clinical psychologists are really trained. Their skills in formulating we're considering sort of, we are quite good at formulating in a way, because we are introduced and we are trained in a range of models and a range of world views, if you like, and then our ability, once you're qualified, to sort of integrate those models to best make sense and help complex patients is where our skill sets lie. So there's probably, we introduced quite a range. You're right, Saba.
Yeah, I was just saying I got rid of the waiting rooms so people can just let them
talk. Oh, okay, fab. There you go, you're on screen then. So there are 5 sort of world views, if you like, in terms of formulating. You've got the CBT approach, which we introduced last week, which is the main one in the NHS really, and the first one you will be trained in. So really you want to have got your head around the CBT formulation if you're going for interviews, and a good place to start is the hot cross bun that we talked about, the 5 Ps. But every sort of way of formulating a worldview comes with its own set of assumptions about illness and how to treat it. And so when you are deciding to formulate from one position, you are holding in mind the assumptions that come with that position, if that makes sense. So for example, I've written some notes here. So for example, a CBT approach, if you're deciding to formulate or work with a patient in that way, you are holding in mind a couple of assumptions about illness and how to get better. So you're assuming that emotional disorders and illnesses, they developed when people are locked into unhealthy patterns of interpreting behaviours. So you assume that we need, in order to get people well, that we and get mental health, that's achieved by evaluating and modifying dysfunctional thinking. So it's all focusing on people's thought patterns, and that in order to get well, we need to modify their dysfunctional thinking in some ways, to change it, to understand it. Does that make sense? So when you're working in a CBT way, you are helping the individual to identify those dysfunctional thought patterns and behaviours and break them down in order to understand them better and hopefully have some more control over them. So that's why you're slowing some of the sometimes thoughts go really quickly, and you're helping patients to slow those down and understand some of the what we call negative automatic thoughts that pop in really quickly, and try to understand them. And we're just thinking, when we're thinking from a CBT approach, we're really thinking about this idea that what we tell ourselves really does impact on how we feel and how we live our life. So if we tell ourselves that we are depressed, or that we're a depressed person, or if we tell ourselves that, you know, we'll never be happy, or we'll never, you know, we're not lovable, or things like this, that has a significant impact on how we live our life and whether we become mentally unwell. So that's to hold in mind. If you're working from CBT point of view, you're really concentrating on the things that people are telling themselves and trying to modify the dysfunctional thought patterns. So think of the hot cross bun when we're thinking of CBT formulations and the 5 Ps. Please just chip in if I'm missing anything out, or you just want to add on. If you think of people, just chip in, because it's really hard. Because it just, from my point of view, it's literally me just talking to myself. So it's really hard to get any sense of if this is making sense to you or not. So please just chip in. Yeah. So you really are thinking about what are those dysfunctional sort of thought patterns. Or unhelpful. If you don't like the word dysfunctional, you don't have to get too hung up with it. Use the word unhelpful, you know, patterns that are unhelpful, and creating a cycle. Okay, so that's CBT. So you've got CBT, systemic, psychodynamic, social construction, and solution focus. They're probably the 5 broad areas or ways that you can think about a problem or think about an illness and help people to get well. As I said, I did just say I'm going to blow your brain on a Saturday morning, and by no means am I going to go into any real depth here, but just giving you an idea that these exist and that there are different ways of viewing a problem and tackling a problem. And that's what sets clinical psychologists apart, really. So apart from a CBT therapist who would really focus on understanding those thought patterns. I mean, CBT has progressed in recent years. You know, we might have heard about things like third wave CBTs, and these are more so, instead of trying to control, the idea with a third wave CBTs, like
DBT?
Yeah, so that's things like acceptance and commitment therapy, compassion focused therapy, mindfulness based therapy, DBT, dialectical behaviour therapy. The assumption there is it's still this assumption that it's the way we think about situations that affects our well-being, but it's less of a focus on content. So traditional CBT would be more about what it is you're saying and the idea of trying to control that, whereas the third wave CBTs are more focused on the process and trying to so mindfulness would be just the process of that flow of consciousness and just being more aware of the thoughts that are happening and your feelings, things like that, rather than having to react and control them. That makes sense? Yeah. So there's some really nice sort of new approaches to therapy coming out. But I don't have to get into all that too much. If you're in an interview and they're asking you about how you formulate from a CBT point of view, you would say that when we're choosing to focus from a CBT point of view, we are really thinking and focusing on people's perceptions and their dysfunctional or unhelpful thought patterns and how that creates illnesses. And we do that by the 5P model and think of the hot cross bun. Okay, so hot cross bun for CBT. So I said systemic, psychodynamic, social construction, and solution focus. Probably only going to have, we'll see how much time we have, but I'll at least touch on all 5 so you know what they are. So systemic formulation is used, we're talking about family systems here. So these are patients when they are in a system. I know everybody lives in a system, as adults we even do, but you're focusing on when the patient lives in a system in their life context, and that they are in the position of least power, if you like. So we're thinking of children, older adults, maybe like elderly, people with learning disabilities, or maybe even people with brain injury, or they're living with families and the families are in the position of power. And the systemic approach is really, really helpful. So hot cross bun for CBT. So when we're talking systemic, we're thinking feedback loops. Okay, is the model for systemic. And so, like the hot cross bun is only part of the CBT formulation, the feedback loops is only part of the systemic. But that's all you need to know for now if you're going to interviews. I think just to even say that you're aware of what feedback loops are will really help you, and when to use a systemic formulation. So like I just said, when you're working with kids or the elderly, people who are living in a family system where they are in a position of the least power, and what we're doing in a systemic formulation, so think about with each worldview what the assumptions are. So I've just gone through what you're holding in mind the assumptions are for CBT. When you're formulating from systemic point of view, we are assuming that the symptoms serve a function in some way of stabilising the family system, so that symptoms that the person has is in some way functioning to stabilise that family system, if that makes sense.
So for example, if someone's like a bit withdrawn socially, is that a symptom of them trying to balance the family system? Yeah, well,
they might have that symptom, but then it's sort of the way it maintains these feedback loops. The problem is maintained because that symptom has arrived, and it's then actually providing some sort of function to stabilise the family unit. Or I'll give you. I've got quite a few examples that I've just formulated a few of my clients just off the top of my head using systemic approach to show you, and it will make a bit more sense when I go through it. But another assumption is that many problems arise from the failing solutions applied to the difficulties. So the idea here is that families problem occurs, like the symptoms or some challenging behaviour, whatever it is that they come to services for, and that problems arise because of failed solutions that the family are trying to come up with. For the best will in the world, they're trying to adapt to this problem, but it's actually reinforcing it. If that makes sense. So their solutions they come up with are reinforcing it somehow. So when we're formulating systemically, we always sort of think, how is the system maintaining the problem, and why? What function is this problem providing the family to keep it sort of stable in some way? So it all makes sense in a minute. So I've got here. So we're thinking feedback loops when we're talking when we're talking systemic. So here. So this is a good book for anyone who actually feels like reading. The Formulation, that tells you all of them, and when you go on the doctorate, they'll make you read that. So it's helpful to just, everything I've said here comes from there, so if you want to know more detail. But you've got feedback loops here. So there's a problem, and the attempted solution sort of creates a difficulty, sort of maintains it. It'll make sense. I want to give you some examples now. Right, so I don't know. Yeah, I should have done like a PowerPoint presentation or something, but then actually I can't see what I've said. I'll read it, and then if you put it to the screen, that'd be nice. So I've got a number of clients here that I've just sat and thought about them from a systemic point of view. So I've got a client who self-harms, I'll hold that there a second. Sorry, guys. So I've got, yeah, the production for this is like really low though.
Just good talk through it. They'll know what you mean by like whatever.
So hold it up at the screen.
No, just
Yeah.
if you
Okay.
want to sit back and like just
right.
explain it, they'll
Okay.
get what you're saying.
Okay. All right. So we've got here at the top the problem. So we've got a problem at the top. So for me, I've got a girl who's a teenage girl who self-harms, and the mum's obviously really worried and has come to me. And to the mum, so can you see this, right? So mum's reaction is that her fear of it is she's become overprotective and controlling of it. You know, so there's two of them that live on their own, and she's become really scared of this. So she's become more like over controlling and overprotective. So she's taken her phone off her, or she's sort of the solutions that she's trying to do. She's requested to see her phone more, who she's in touch with. You know, she wants to know more about where her daughter is all the time. She's asking her to see her arms. She's really sort of kind of gone overprotective and more controlling sort of mode. And then what that has actually done is, you know, made Sally feel like, Sally's not a real name, but it's made Sally feel like she's got less control over her life. She's actually got more defensive and sort of got angry with her mum and sort of retreated in herself. So the communication has broke down. That makes mum get more stressed and tighten her grip even more, and makes her even more controlling, and makes her want to, and the anger that Sally has then made mum angry and said, well, you know, this has sort of got into a mode of like, this is sort of attention seeking, this is ridiculous. Mum's got frustrated and angry and got more controlling, and it's sort of maintaining an unhealthy pattern. That's called a feedback loop, and how it's maintaining. But where we go one step further in systemic thinking is like, why? We're always really thinking and hold in mind that assumption with systemic formulation is, what function is this self-harming behaviour providing? Because it's being maintained, they're keeping this pattern for a reason. So what function is providing? So you really are holding a few, and you get this information by asking more questions. You're doing a genogram to find out more about the context and what's going on, and all the while thinking about what function is this providing to stabilise the family unit. And you are just hypothesising at this point, okay? It's all just hypotheses you come up in your mind. But I know in the context here with the mum, I know that the mum, because they live on their own, so it's just mum and daughter, I know as a result of Sally starting to self-harm, the mum has then become closer to her mum. She's felt quite separate from her mum for quite a while, and felt like her mum pays more attention to other siblings. So the mother has got 3 other siblings, and she's felt like she's been on her own for quite a few years and felt like she's always had to be the strong one to cope with it. But since this has come up, she's talked about that her mom, her mom, so Sally's grandma, like, has been a real source of support. So the grandma and the mom are actually really close, and she's getting attention from her mom as a result of this, you know. And this is just this could be nothing, but this is what you're doing in a systemic formulation. You are holding in mind, you're thinking, what else is going on in the system and in the context, what's happening that's maintaining this behaviour, what function is it providing, why is it being maintained? And I just know that since the self-harming's come along, it's actually made the mom and the grandma closer. You know, so you just think, you know, and there could be other things, but you find that out through your genogram, you find that out through just asking more questions. So all the while you draw a loop of the behaviours that's maintaining it, but thinking, what function is this? Why is this being maintained? What is this person here getting that is stopping them from breaking the cycle? You know, so that's what you're doing in systemic formulation. So one hypothesis come to mind with this lady is that actually, as a result of self-harming of her daughter, it's brought her and her mom, like the grandma, closer together. Okay. You know, so actually she's getting more attention from her mom as a result of it. She's got her mom is giving the mother, the grandma is giving the mother more attention, whereas she has previously been giving the other siblings more attention, because I know that the other siblings have had quite eventful lives and have always sort of left the family home and come back and have had sort of quite chaotic lives. So the mother, the grandmother, has always, it seems in the story, that the mother is created, that she's sort of seen as the one that's left to just deal with things on her own, and now this is an opportunity, it seems, to where she's getting some attention and support from the grandparents. So you know, you find this out through just asking questions and being curious, and it is always just a hypothesis. You just kind of make a mental note and you asking more questions at this moment in time, but you're always thinking with that basic assumption of what function is the problem providing to maintain, to stabilise the family unit in some way. So another example is, I've got a client called Mary. So Mary is diagnosed with, the problem is with early onset dementia. So this is the problem you look at. Now the husband, as a result of this diagnosis, the husband has started to do more and more, if not all, the tasks for her. Has sort of started, and this is a very common pattern you see if you start working in dementia services or older adult services, that the partner, through like good intentions, this is all, that we're not sort of judging here when we're doing this, we're saying here, we're implying with this model that the families are trying their best, it's good intentions, but it's their failed solution, it's like their solutions are being unhelpful to maintain it, you know. The people are always trying the best they know how, but so problems arise. Mary's been diagnosed with early onset dementia, and then the husband has just started doing more and more, if not pretty much taking over now all the tasks, which then leads to de-skilling for Mary, and she's lacking confidence, which then leads the husband to get more stressed and doing more of the tasks and having less confidence in her. And then you see how it just you know, creates more stress and de-skilling, and just maintains the problem and just gets a problem first. And so it's quite simple and easy to come up with some feedback loops that are going on based on what questions you're asking. But then it's the bigger question that you ask now is like, what function, what's going on in the wider context? So you're assuming that this diagnosis is somehow functioning, is providing some sort of function to stabilise the family, you know, and you're just holding it in mind really loosely, hypothesis. And I'm thinking, knowing this family, I'm thinking, something I've written down is that it makes him feel, so I know about his context, that he's quite recently retired, and he was a busy man and he was an important man in his job, and since he's been retired he's lost like a sense of purpose and a position of power, or you know, like a role, which has been really important his whole life. And I wonder, and I've been wondering, that since this diagnosis, he's been able to actually, in some way, he's given him a role again, you know, with a sense of like, not power would perhaps be an unhelpful word, but it's given him like a role, yeah, that he'd lost from after his job, you know, and it's sort of providing some sort of role for him that gives him a sense of purpose or sense of clarity on how he needs to behave. I think he's gone a bit lost as he got retired. But I'm just holding that in mind as a hypothesis. But you're always thinking with systemic formulation, what function does the problem create? Like how is the problem functioning to stabilise the family in some way? And in order to get that information, you need more information of the wider context. So a good way to do that is through the genograms that we did in the webinar a few months ago. Genograms are a lovely way to just find out more information about who's in the family and relationships, but just generally being curious and asking questions about the history and what's going on. You'll pick it up in natural conversation. You will, so I wouldn't worry too much. But as you go into interviews, just as you're showing interviews, that you know what these are, but also you can start practicing. You can practice formulating on people around you. You know, I've just done a few here based on clients I have, and I'm not working in a systemic way with them, but I can think systemically systemically about them. So you can just practice developing your skill now. And lots of people in your life, like start to practice doing systemic formulation, because the more you practice it, the more your brain thinks that you're actually doing it, you know, for real. So that then that will come across in interviews, you know, you'll believe yourself, you'll have confidence. So I would really, really recommend just practicing, just formulating people, you know. So Jacob is another one, as a young lad, he's in his early 20s, and he's come for long-term gambling and drug addiction. So that's the problem. And then the mother. So I've just used I've just used a relationship between two people at the moment. We can see how systemic formulations can get really complicated if the more people you add into it, the more family members. It still looks the same in terms of the feedback loops, but you've got more things to hold in mind. But I don't want to overcomplicate the situation at the moment. So just using the dynamics between two at the moment. So we've got, but in this situation, and this is a mother and son who they don't live together, but he's an only child and she's divorced. He's in his early 20s now, but they've had a long-standing sort of conflict. Seems to be a bit of a dynamic going on. And so the mother, in response to the gambling and drug addiction, she started to take control and sort of make decisions on behalf of his life, like makes big life decisions for him, and is quite rejecting of his ideas. You know, so that's sort of her position. It seems to be that's sort of what she's doing. She was the one who, it almost felt like when he came here that she's literally dragged him to the session. You know, it's how it felt. You know, he's the whole body language. He even said himself, like, he didn't want to be here. His mom literally had dragged him to come, and out of desperation, you know, and out of love. Like, and it's what we're saying here is that the family are trying the best way they know how, but it's unhelpful. It actually maintains the problem. So, you know, so she's taken control. She's dragging him here, and she's actually quite rejected because then he has lack of control. He gets angry that she's interfering, and then she rejects. He's quite rejecting and saying, "You're not trying things. You know, you're just wasting your life." And then he gets more angry and sort of and then there's more disconnect between the two of them, which then fuels the problem, because the more he feels angry and out of control, the more he then turns to drugs and gambling. Keeps it going. So it's quite sort of, as I say, it's quite sort of easy to do a feedback loop. The sort of the more bit that you have to think a bit more, be more curious about, and ask more questions, is how the problem, like what function is providing in the family to sort of maintain it. You know, and I just know from speaking to the mom a bit more that she's actually sort of she's been on her own a while, and she's actually sort of over the years had this problem. She started joining some support groups, and has been quite an activist for like gambling, not activist for gambling, activist for like families with people who gamble and things. So she's actually, we have to think about the role and the identity she's forming, and what that's providing for her now that was missing before, you know, and it's actually sort of maintaining it some way, if that makes sense. Yeah. You know, so I was just thinking about this wider picture. And just another one as well, I've got a young girl with disability, and the parents, so I've got a disability, the parents feel guilty about this, that she's born with a disability, and they feel guilty, and they just give her everything she wants. So they don't stand up to her, they give her everything she wants, but they also treat her like she's delicate, you know, and they sort of tread on eggshells. Oh, she can't possibly do that, you know, or think of a disability, everything is always framed in a disability, you know, she can't do that, she's too delicate. So then that makes her really anxious and dependent on mum and dad, you know, and it creates the cycle of dependency. Then they feel like they have to do everything for her, and that they feel really hopeless, and then that sort of just maintains it, doesn't sort of help her with her independence and start to live a life without the disability, or think it like without that sort of you know, being about her whole identity, you know. So you see, but I haven't really, I don't know this family enough yet to sort of have some ideas about how it's functioning, but you all, how this provides a function to stabilise the family unit. But there will be, if you are holding in mind a systemic formulation, then you are assuming that there will be, this will be providing a function some way. You just need to gather more information. So does that make sense? Systemic? There's not a lot of time, is there? Okay. So systemic hat. So yeah, so if you are on, if you're working in children's services now, or when you go on training and you're on your children's placement or learning disability placement, absolutely, you will be thinking from a systemic point of view, and you will have the opportunities in those services to have families in, so they can ask lots of questions about the context, about what's going on. At the time in your assessment, you'll be getting lots of information, using the genogram to help you, but just being generally curious and asking a lot of information, and then you start to as you formulate, you're thinking about the feedback loops and how the problem is providing a function for the family to stabilise it. What roles people it gives people. Does that make sense? Yeah. Being able to get that, you have to get the wider picture. So that's systemic. So take off your systemic hat. So CBT, think cross buttons and 5 Ps. Systemic, think for feedback loops. Of course, there is more to a systemic formulation, but that is all you need at this stage you're at. And that's really helpful. It's really, really helpful just to hold that in mind. Now, put psychodynamic hat on. Now, psychodynamic is not my area of expertise, but psychodynamic is actually really, really helpful if you're working with particularly complex personality disorder patients, and it's trying to understand some of the dynamics in the room that you might get drawn into. So it's less common as a therapeutic approach in the NHS in modern day times, but it is absolutely relevant in supervision with your supervisor. Absolutely worth thinking about these issues that I'm going to explain about transference and counter-transference. It's really, really important just to understand what that is and how you some patients might be transferring things onto you, and how you subconsciously are relaying them back to them. So it's really, really useful to hold psychodynamic formulations in mind in supervision. But when you go on placement, you might actually have a supervisor who is very psychodynamic if you're lucky enough. A bit rarer, but that's just really helpful. But yes, you won't be expected to know the ins and outs of it, but just at this stage to understand about how to apply it. So you'd be saying something like, you'll be understanding it when you're working with personality disorders, particularly to understand what's going on in the room. Absolutely. So that's perfect. And you'll probably be thinking of some patients will come to mind, particularly. I know a few. So psychodynamic formulation then, right? Okay. So with every formulation, like we do, it comes with its own set of assumptions. So if you just imagine putting on a psychodynamic hat, when you put on that hat, you are now approaching mental illnesses and how to get better with a certain set of assumptions. Okay. So if you got your psychodynamic hat on, you're assuming that our mental life is a shifting flow constantly influenced by psychic pain and the drive to avoid it through distorting or concealing our knowledge of its sources. So this is, of course, subconscious defense mechanisms. So psychodynamic perspective is really, really assumes that our mental, our consciousness is just all about trying to avoid psychic pain. Okay, goes against, you can understand, I just want to make a point here. You can understand one perspective. You don't have to agree with it, but it's about understanding how it is useful. Okay, and this psychodynamic absolutely has its uses in certain contexts. So it's assumptions as well. Is psychic pain is due to inner conflicts between parts of the self. Okay, so across one CBT. Feedback loops, systemic. We are talking triangles with psychodynamic. Okay, psychodynamic triangles. Now, this might blow your brain on a Saturday morning. It blows mine because I'm not a psychodynamic therapist, but I'm going to try my best to give you a gist anyway, so you can at least go away and think on it a bit more. So it's all in this book anyway. It's a really good book, Formulation, the one I showed you. So I'd have a read. So you've got triangles here. I might have to come down here for this one. So you've got triangle of conflict, okay? So I've just said that psychic pain comes from, the assumption with psychodynamic is that psychic pain is due to inner conflicts between parts of the self. So we have a hidden feeling that could be like a wish or a impulse or a desire. And how it works is that hidden feeling, an awareness of this feeling, creates anxiety because its expression would be in conflict with another perceived need, and is therefore then feared to have catastrophic consequences. And then a subconscious defense mechanism kicks in, like repression or projection or denial or dissociation. You'll have heard of all these. Okay, so for example, for someone, a feeling of anger or rage, for example, hidden feeling, and then an associated impulse to hurt, for example, is perceived as disturbing or even unacceptable in the context of a relationship in which you're dependent upon that person and need their love and good opinion for continued well-being. So then that creates the anxiety. So if you've got a hidden feeling of anger or rage, and then an impulse to hurt the person in your relationship, that creates the anxiety because it creates the conflict, because you actually need that person and their good opinion for your well-being. So there's the conflict there. Then that leads to a subconscious defense. So it might be that you project those feelings of anger or rage onto the partner, or maybe you just repress it and you just sort of push it down and block it out, but then it comes up in other ways. So the conflict here becomes, I hate you, but I'm afraid I will destroy our relationships, which I need and depend on. So when you're working psychodynamically, you're thinking about what the inner conflict is for the individual. But more importantly, in the therapy room is this next formulation. I don't know if you can quite see that very well. It's called the triangle of the person. So the idea here is that it shows that past relationships here are echoed in the present. So they are replayed in the client's current relationships and also in the therapy room. So basically here with this formulation is how your patient is, the dynamics between you and your patient. We assume with a psychodynamic formulation that they're replaying their dynamics in other relationships and from the past. So the idea here is that the past is being played out in the current, in the present. So when you're formulating from a psychodynamic perspective, it's all about the relationship between you and the patient, because that gives you clues about their past and the sort of the conflicts that are arising, if that makes sense. So are we doing all right for time? In 5 minutes we can answer questions. Yeah, I was just saying. The term transference and counter-transference is really important in psychodynamic. Transference is the feeling that the client will put onto you. So if you have ever noticed, transference will feel really out of place for you. So you might find yourself just feeling like feelings of like intense dislike for a patient, or really even like hating a patient, and you think, that's not me, but you're aware, like, I've had it before, really hating a patient. Actually, and another one is love as well, like loving, feelings of love or hate, these sort of feelings that you feel like don't have a place, or feel like what's going on here. And it can be really helpful to talk about them in supervision, because it is the idea with psychodynamic formulation. It's the subconscious, it's the transference that's coming from the patient and they're putting onto you, and then counter-transference is then what you subconsciously then put back onto the patient. So if you're not aware of these dynamics by talking about them in formulation, if they are projecting the hate onto you because of they're playing out past relationships I've just talked about, they're putting hate onto you and you're not aware of that, then you subconsciously, it changes how then you relate to them. Maybe you get defensive, or maybe the way you use words or your body language, shows that hate, so it's really, really helpful to just be aware of any unusual feelings that you have that are coming up in the therapy room. So as a psych assistant at this level, you would just be expected to share them, or is it, well, not even as a psych assistant, because it can be if your supervisor isn't psychodynamically trained, it can be quite difficult, I think, to say to your supervisor, I have feelings of hate towards my patient, but actually just knowing this gives you some theoretical and some backing in this, because this is one way of formulating.
I guess it helps to sort of like articulate how you feel about a client.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you come out of the session, you just don't even know how to explain how you felt.
Absolutely, and then you can start looking into yourself and think it's you can without being aware of it, you can own it. Instead of saying actually this is theirs, they're putting onto me, you can own it, and you say, well, what am I doing wrong? I'm a bad therapist, and all the rest of it. So, but it's knowing that this is transference they're putting onto you, and then as you get more skilled during training, you might even have the confidence in your therapy to use words to explain it to the patient, and sort of say, I'm curious about this feeling, and as if this is a dynamic that has played out in other relationships. Do you feel it takes a lot of confidence and a bit of training, but you might say something like, I'm feeling a bit hurtful, or wondering about, curious about, are you feeling hurt right now, or is this how you relate to others, sort of thing. So you're able to talk about that transference and counter-transference in the room. That's quite a skilled psychodynamic, psychoanalytic psychotherapists have years of training to be able to do this, and you would be expected to have conversations with patients about that. But you working in NHS in busy services, particularly with complex patients with personality disorders, bringing this model to supervision is really, really important and very useful. So I just wanted you to today, just in the time we've got, just to at least to highlight the gist of it, and so that you can go away and think about it further. We've got like 5 more minutes just before we ask questions, so I just really quickly, I won't go into any detail whatsoever, but just to at least tell you what a social constructionist perspective is and a solution focused hat is, without absolutely blowing your mind, but just so at least you know, because really, so that when we say with confidence as a clinical psychologist, we really are highly skilled at formulating, because we don't understand just one view, we understand 5 main sort of world views about how to think about a problem. And then the skill comes when you hear someone saying, like, if you ever hear someone saying an integrative formulation, then that's people sort of using a range of models at the same time. But be able to do that, you need to understand what all the models are first. Okay, so social construction is I'm just going to go through what the assumptions are with this. If you're putting this, so put a hat on if you're social construction. So it just assumes that what we know as reality is socially constructed, basically, so that there are different realities. So it's all about, social construction is all about language. It assumes language, and the narratives we use is a central way that we view the world. So it's all about, narrative therapy is social constructionist way of viewing the therapy. So it assumes that problems, and as I say this now, you'll probably have experiences yourself that come to mind. I know I do. It says it assumes that problems occur when the stories people have available about themselves do not accord with their lived experience. And this is really, really important to think of this if you are working in an institution like a prison or an inpatient setting, where you can see that certain narratives are being built up about a patient, and they're becoming the dominant narrative, and then how then that creates the problems, or creates this. It's all about stories with social construction. It's this idea that we have different realities. It's all about different stories, and that we are just this is just one story we're telling about a patient, but there are other stories. This model, or this way of thinking, assumes that problems occur. To think about a patient, problems occur when the stories that they have available to themselves, so these dominant narratives that are being said about, you think about in the prison, the dominant narratives that are being told about people, that do not accord with their own lived experience. So then that's, there's a real, it's all about power, and there's a real power dynamic. So when you're thinking with a social constructionist hat on, you're thinking about here, what is the dominant narratives, and how can I ask different questions? How can I start to create different stories about this person, and you might not necessarily use this in therapy with someone. What you'd use as a psychologist if you're working in a bigger institution is most definitely when you're doing formulation meetings with a team, or reflective practice, when you're doing case formulations with your team, because that's a big role as a psychologist is to do case formulations with a team. And what you're trying to do there is help you understand that there are different realities, and what questions are we not asking, what is the dominant narrative, so really encouraging people to think differently and ask different questions.
You do find that in very teams, you hear about specific patients, and then you'll have a different experience with them, so it's hard to challenge what they think. But then also that dominant kind of narrative actually then influences how people work with them. Absolutely, because they're taking it on without even making kind of, not a judgment, but not taking that in with them.
Yeah, absolutely. A big one in the prison is personality disorder. Oh, he's got personality disorder. Then that becomes a dominant narrative, and then people seem to it seems to then sort of an automatic play of sort of how we relate then to this individual sort of gets set in motion, and where you don't actually hear. It tells you nothing about who the person is. But it just seems to clump people together, and it's really, really unhelpful. So a psychologist should really be asking, encouraging your team to think about the person as individual and what their story is, and just asking, you'd be looking to challenge in a respectful way, but just sort of in a curious way, sort of challenge some of these dominant narratives, because we are people in these institutions in positions of power, and we are creating the reality for the patient by how we are viewing them and the narratives we're using. And then solution focus. Okay, this is why our work is my favourite. It assumes that everyone has. So rather than psychodynamic is all about that you're conscious, it's just about the motivation for your consciousness is just about avoiding pain. Solution focus is about that everyone, this assumption that everyone has sufficient wisdom and resourcefulness in their main cortex here, in this subconscious mind, to be able to cope effectively with life. Okay, so that assumes that everyone has enough resources available in their own brain to be able to cope effectively with life. But problems occur when we're not activating, we're not connecting to those brain regions that we connect to different parts of the brain, like the limbic system, the brain regions lower down. The idea is that problems occur when we're not engage in our main cortex and using it the way it's designed to. So the assumption is that our main cortex is a solution-based organism, and we function better when our mind is working in a successful solution-based mode. So the idea is that the solution focus, we don't even focus on the problem. We get a bit of a gist when people come. We need a bit of an idea of why people are here, but then the focus is then on what do you want, and what do you want to achieve. And that is the focus of therapy, and the idea that the more focus on what the mind focuses on what it wants rather than what it doesn't want, when it takes the attention away from the problem, starts focusing on the solution, you start to create more of what we call serotonin in the brain, which is what gives you the feeling of certainty and confidence that you can cope with life, and this calmness. And as that increases and the cortisol comes down, getting the chemical balance right, then you're able to have the confidence to tackle the problem. Or actually what happens is you're focusing over here on what you want, the problem just sort of fades away on its own, so that's a different way of approaching it. So that's solution focused sort of hat.
I like solution focused because you ask them questions so they develop. And I don't like when people try to tell someone.
Absolutely. And it assumes that this part of the brain is a solution focused organ, so it works best when it's in that mode. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes.
Should we look at what
through that? So
if we look at what questions we have. So someone's asking, can we please see the first sheet of the feedback loop? What I can do is we can show you it now, but then if you want I can put it in
a feedback loop's like that.
box.
So you've got the problem, there. So like I said, the problem, it was for one person it was gambling, one person the problem was early onset dementia, or someone else was self-harming. And then here is the attempted solution from a family member. So, you know, good intentions, you know, they're trying to help, but their good intentions are somehow creating, maintaining the problem. So attempted solution then leads to difficulty from the patient. So that's sort of the family member. And then a difficulty creates a difficulty in the patient, and then that sort of reinforces it, just keeps it going. But then when you got that loop, you're then thinking, once you've got that, which is can be quite that's quite straightforward sometimes to get, but then it's the question of, right, how is this, what function is this problem providing in the family unit that's stabilizing it? You know, what's the bigger picture here? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Someone's asked, can you please explain a little bit about how the power threat meaning framework is linked with these 4 approaches?
Power threat meaning, I don't know the context of that framework, because there are literally hundreds and hundreds of conceptual frameworks in psychology.
If you could give more, like, if I think it's Misla, if you could please give more details about what you mean about the power threat meaning framework. Someone else asked about the psychodynamic approach. Could you show the parallel triangle that is created, please?
So the triangle of the person.
Yeah.
So all of this is in that book, and maybe if you googled the triangle of Malan's triangle of person, you might get this up. But this is the triangle of conflict that talks about before, and then it sort of plays out in their relationships with other people, and the past, and the therapist in the room. So you want to be focusing on here. You know, so basically it's the clues are in the transference. The clues are in the transference. So what feeling you get you know, what are the dynamics that are coming off? There are some really helpful there are some really nice dynamic models available. So if anyone has heard about transactional analysis, that's a dynamic model that's about the parent, child, and adult, about critical parents. And I look up transactional analysis. We've actually used that in our context, didn't we, to understand what was going on. Transactional analysis, but also there's something called reciprocal roles in CAT, in cognitive analytical therapy. So cognitive analytical therapy is a combination between CBT and psychodynamic, and there's something in it's very complicated. It's very complicated for me. I like the simplicity of solution focused methods, but the reciprocal roles in the CAT model, if you want to Google that and learn a bit more about dynamics there, that's a really nice dynamic model as well.
Someone else said someone asked a question about doing the CBT hot cross bun thing again, but I'll just say that we've done a video on that previously. If you want to look at that, we've gone into a lot of detail there.
We did that in the last one, didn't we?
Yeah, there's someone else that said, for systemic, you mainly spoke about family system, but the maintaining factor that can be derived from other environments such as friendship groups, work teams, that feeds into the difficulty of the client's experience. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a systemic formulation, I showed you just a basic systemic feedback loop there when we're talking about 2 people. So a system can get as complicated as you want. You know, you can bring in like the wider family, can bring in the friend network. But you really want to be focusing on at the moment is just really getting your head around what the model is, and you know, make it easy for yourself, understand what's going on, maybe with your patient, between them and the mother, or them and the parents and their family unit, because you can sort of overcomplicate yourself and then not really get a sense of that you're applying your skills to help her in a clinical setting, you know, which is what it's all about, isn't it, for interviews and things like that. Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. But yes,
I was just going to start with the feedback loop. When you do add in kind of more areas of their life, do you do kind of one feedback loop for each area, or do you just put it in one? And
yeah, it sort of gets clumped together as a general sort of how is the family unit responding to this, you know, it's a sort of general thing,
Oh,
if that makes sense.
Okay.
But you will need more information to get that, you know, and there will be a few more dynamics to sort of pick up on. But, you know, in a clinical setting, you probably want to just start with the immediate family. You know, if you're working with CAM services or children, you know, it will be very appropriate to ask all the family to come in, you know, so siblings and mum and dad or mom or whoever it is. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think she said something about the power threat thing. I've just started reading about it, how it talks about symptoms being things you did to survive something that happened. Also mentions about power and narrative. Rather than saying what is wrong with you, asks what you had to do to survive. I wonder if that sort of concept has anything to do with these approaches, or is that just like, do you think that's like an anxiety response?
that sounds very narrative, doesn't it? Like it would fit into like the social constructionist sort of view about so I've not heard of that model and that framework, and there is you'll realise when you go into training there are hundreds and hundreds of different models, and I don't know the context of the author and their sort of orientation. So when you know about a model, you know usually sort of who wrote it and where they're aligned with. Because usually, you know, when you come out of training, and you start to learn more about yourself and you practice different ones, you'll naturally become more aligned with one model or a few. And we know from research that there's no sort of, I'm going off on a tangent here, sorry, I'll come back to that, but like, there's no sort of better way, but what we know from research in terms of getting good outcomes is what's called like a therapeutic alliance, and one of the ways to get a therapeutic alliance is that the therapist is delivering, is working from a framework that fits with them.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean? So that helps, because that helps the patient have confidence and trust in you, and then that helps develop therapeutic alliance. So we know from research it's not necessarily about the model you're using, it's the therapeutic alliance and the congruence between the therapist and the model that they're developing. Does that make sense?
I think as an assistant, everyone, you just think you need to know all of them.
Yeah, but it's a bit like you just need to have a gist and an idea of what they are, and you don't need to be CBT is very popular, so it's good to have and it really is really helpful, so it's good to have a good understanding of that. But it is also a bit like when you do your GCSEs and you're made to do like subjects that you're not interested in. Training is a bit like that. You all have to practice doing models that perhaps you disagree with or doesn't fit with you, but you have to learn it to understand what you learn more about yourself like that. But that's part of training. But I'll go back to that model. So that one.
So the power threat meaning framework.
Mostly developed by an alternative to diagnosis. So that does sound, who did that? Is that Charlotte? That does sound very social constructionist, because the social constructionist sort of view doesn't use formulation. They don't use diagnosis, don't use formulation. So it sounds very sort of that approach.
I think what Charlotte said is quite right. It's not like a model, it's more just like an overarching sort of framework,
conceptual framework.
So I think someone said, like, how are we supposed to know which one to speak about in interviews?
You can't go wrong by focusing on CBT, because as you're going on to the training, you'll need you'll be expected to know about that. So you'd want to give examples of how you use that with patients, so that hot cross bun, you do that quite regularly with people, don't you? You can even, if you haven't got patients, but you practice it with just formulating people, so you get used to it.
It might be worth researching where the interviews with, because they might tell you kind of what strategy they take. A lot of them do that actually, don't they? They tell you what in their values and their frameworks that they use.
Absolutely.
Different models that they use, if they're using DBT or something.
Well, like you said, some of them, specifically you mentioned areas of personality disorder or children, like maybe just be aware that commonly used in that area that you
Yeah,
might know
like
about.
talk about maybe what you use, but then show that you're aware of what they possibly might
and
be
it
using.
could be applied in that setting.
Yeah.
But then how you would use them, you know, so like we said, the psychodynamic formulation is absolutely used in supervision to understand the dynamics that's going on in the therapy room with a complex patient. You know, the social constructionist is sort of the narrative one. About dominant narratives. You use that. I've used that before in formulation meetings in groups for us to really reflect on what the dominant narrative is and how we can create new narratives and new realities. The CBT one is one that you can very easily do with patients, collaborative with patients, and systemic works well when you are working with families. Like I said, and solution focused as well is really, solution focused is difficult in the NHS because the whole setup is that you are there to focus on the problem and treat symptoms, you know, so it's hard to be completely solution focused in the NHS, but it still doesn't mean you can't work in a solution focused way. So you're focusing on what's been good, you know, for the individual and what they want, and how to achieve it.
And trying to kind of put into like your therapy sessions. I've used it a few aspects of it.
Trying to highlight differences. You see, you use scaling. This is coming into next month now when we start talking about interventions and things that we can, because next month we'll start to talk about different interventions and therapies, but also like little things you can do with people under the different sort of approaches. You know, so like they're going into too much detail because I know time's up, but you know, solution focus. You use scaling, and we put people on like a happiness scale, whereas you would, if you're doing CBT, you'd focus on distress scale and scaling. So scaling is really good, really good intervention. So I'll probably say that for next week, but I'll show you how there's different scaling that you can use and what you're doing in the brain to help people there.
Okay, I think we're up for time, aren't we? So
have we covered all the questions?
Yeah, pretty much.
All right.
But I will upload this as a YouTube video, and if you've got any questions for the next webinar, maybe just direct message me. But yeah, thank you everyone for attending.
The next one will be on interventions, so we'll see you in a month. Thank you.
See ya. Bye.